for anybody who's been following climate, you know that we're not in a great place globally in terms of where we need to be driving down emissions of greenhouse gases. This is the global sort of stock take from a couple of years ago, from 2023. And if you followed the Conference of the Party that the UN just held a couple of weeks ago, you know that there's not been great improvement here. You know, the historical emissions are there in the dark. And what science tells us is we need to reduce our current level of global ambient temperatures to between 1.5 and 2C to avoid the worst impacts of climate change on our planet, many of which are already underway due to all the historical emissions we've had going back. And the sort of red triangle there is what countries have committed to in terms of their national plans for making reductions. And if you could see that even that doesn't get us onto that trajectory that we need to be on for the higher end of the range. And the unfortunate fact is most countries have not met the commitments they've made in those national plans for climate mitigation. So we're quite far behind where we need to be. And, you know, states like California, Massachusetts, New York are really still in the vanguard of leading on the mitigation side. And so we are here in Massachusetts in a better place relative to a 2050 goal. And for those of you who follow this closely, the parlance for climate mitigation is that we want to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And what that means is, you know, if you look at the curve for Massachusetts and you look at our historical emissions here, which were sort of in the neighborhood of about 100 million metric tons per year, starting in 1990, what that means is by 2050, we need to drive down emissions from our cars, our buildings, our industry, and we're probably not going to get rid of all of the fossil fuels by 2050. There's going to be some combustion left that we need to do because we don't have a low carbon fuel or a zero carbon fuel to substitute for certain things. For those of you who are driving an EV right now, or may have even driven one here tonight, you know that you've displaced all that gasoline use and you're replacing that with electricity and much greater efficiency in the vehicle. But there's still some carbon in that electricity embedded in there. And we're going to try to drive that out too. And that's how we get a lot of those reductions in the transportation sector. Similarly, in the building sector, we swap out our oil furnaces and gas furnaces for heat pumps. And that's how we get a lot of those reductions. So we're doing quite a good job here in Massachusetts. And the state has a lot of plans for more heat pumps, more EVs, more charging stations. But at the end of the day, there's still some things that are pretty difficult to decarbonize. One of them is heavy duty transport. And so, you know, long haul trucking, aviation, and frankly, you know, we're probably going to need some fossil fuels like natural gas for industry too. So then how do we get to zero? What's the net zero part of the, you know, how do we get to that zero? And the sort of teal part that you see there is what's happening now. That's the carbon removal that our forest and terrestrial ecosystems are providing as they draw through photosynthesis, they draw carbon out of the atmosphere, and they're pulling currently 10% of our annual emissions are being negated and removed by our forests and our terrestrial ecosystems. So that kind of engine of carbon removal that we frankly kind of take for granted because it happens and it's wonderful and we don't really do so much to sort of pay for that carbon or compensate anyone for it. It's continuing on, but we need to hold on to what we have, and we probably need to grow that carbon removal in some way. That could mean growing forests, making sure they're protected over time. There are technological forms of carbon removal that are under development, including direct air capture. None of these are currently commercially viable. And just one kind of figure I'll have you hold on to, because we'll need to use it later, is thinking about $150 to $200 per ton of carbon from those direct air capture machines is probably what it will cost if they become commercially viable. And so that's what we need to get to net zero in Massachusetts, and then think about every other jurisdiction in the world also needing some form of carbon removal to get to that net zero level. So we have a great solar ecosystem here. We're actually doing really well overall in terms of the amount of solar we've deployed. We're definitely a national leader in incentives to use some of our landfills, our brownfields. There's a great project in Lexington on the landfill there. And we've, created incentives such that even states that have started to do this, we still have the most solar on landfills in the country. Even though obviously there are states with way more landfills than we have. And we're doing a good job on rooftop solar on a per capita basis, community solar, which is sort of like subscription solar on a per capita basis. And then our solar incentive program, which is called SMART, is continuing to deploy a lot of these projects on urban infill, community, and distributed. And the federal climate action under the Inflation Reduction Act has definitely had a significant impact. And we hope that most of that can stay in place, and including a big grant that Massachusetts won last year called Solar for All, which is trying to get more solar into lower income communities. That's $150 million. And so we're hoping we can get that locked down before the new administration. And some great examples here in Framingham on the edge of a development, and then Worcester on a former landfill, a 26-acre of project there. But really the reason that we started to think about, well, gosh, maybe we need to take a deeper look at this, is that we're also seeing, especially over the last decade plus, some really big projects that are utility scale, ground mount projects, that are really starting to have a pretty significant impact on our natural marking lands. And so each of these blue dots here is a ground mount solar installation, with the larger the dot is larger project. And you can see this pattern here where you've got, an enormous number of projects in southern Worcester County and through the southern tier of the state into Bristol and Plymouth counties. And I mean, it's a couple of reasons for that spatial pattern. First of all, like generally you're going to do more solar the further south you are, at least in the northern hemisphere, you got more solar potential. And then it's also a function of there being places to plug in that solar. So there's grid interconnections and in those places. And so that's where the developers went first, along with relatively inexpensive land that's flatter. And so that's part of the rationale behind the pattern you see there. So, the status quo, the way we have done solar and the way that we will do it until the new law takes effect, is that really it's where the developer can find a landowner that wants to host the project. So there's no sort of natural resource guardrails or considerations. It's really where is an agreement between a solar developer who finds a parcel that makes sense economically for them to develop, and an agreement from that landowner. So the footprint that you just saw of all those projects, when we sort of look at the land cover types that are impacted, we've seen a really similar pattern to land cover in the state. So Massachusetts, once we stopped at the turn of the century, we stopped all that logging that was being done, and we had this incredible rebound in our forest. We have 60% of our land covers under forest. And interestingly, the pattern of the projects is also 60% on forest. And we have about 14% of our land mass is cultivated land or farmland. The projects, similarly, their footprint has been about 14% of the total footprint of all the solar projects. Is 14% of that is on farmland. And so, the conversion that we've estimated of that forest carbon into CO2 emissions, from that loss of that carbon removal from the forests that have been impacted to date as of 2020 is about 112,000 cars equivalent annual emissions, which in the grand scheme, frankly, is not like an enormous amount, but it's sort of like a small slice. And if we think about continuing that same pattern on over the next 25 years, it really starts to chip into that carbon removal engine that you saw in the previous slide. And it's not only carbon we care about with our forests. We know they're incredibly rich habitat for all kinds of species, including species that are endangered and threatened here in the Commonwealth, or are federally endangered and threatened. We also know that it's pretty tough to farm in Massachusetts. And so when you see conversion of either farmland that's currently productive or could be productive, that's, a significant impediment to sort of food security here in the Commonwealth. So this is that southeastern part of the state, Wareham and Carver, where we saw in May of 2010, these parcels were forest, in some cases forest plus gravel pits, and those have been converted. And that's an area of the state that, interesting, the carbon content of the forest is not as high as, say, central or western Mass, but you do have a lot of globally rare species in that sort of pitch pine habitat. So that's an area of concern as much for biodiversity as it is for the loss of the carbon. So we were sort of looking at this pattern and we thought, well, gosh, like we know we've got one of the most densely populated states in the country. We also have a lot of ambition on climate mitigation, which is fantastic, but we also have lots of forests and a lot of natural resource values that we want to hold on to. So is there a sort of more optimal way of doing this is kind of what we wanted to test out. Knowing that we also need to deliver energy at reasonable prices to ratepayers. And we have, sadly, the third or fourth highest electricity cost in the country too. So trying to balance all that is not easy. We decided, well, we have expertise in land use change at Mass Audubon, and the natural resources. We paired up with Harvard Forest researchers who have both the geospatial analysis capability and the forest carbon knowledge. And then we brought on the same team that has done the energy modeling for the state's climate plan, the Evolved Energy team, to also do the energy modeling here to make sure that the solar that we modeled for could meet the state's goals. So really our goal was, can we find a footprint for solar that meets the state's goals for clean energy, because we know we need that, but also is more protective of the natural working lands and all of the ecosystem functions that those lands provide. By getting creative about, some of the sites where we put the solar, and of course, really leveraging how much built environment we've got. A lot of buildings, especially the eastern part of the state, and we have 50,000 acres of parking lots in the Commonwealth, and plenty of commercial rooftops as well. So what we did in terms of like creating scenarios to compare and contrast to one another, we created one scenario. It's like what you just saw over the last 10 years and really kind of extrapolating that pattern. So in other words, no constraints on where these systems are sited, but continuing on to use the lowest cost projects wherever they may land. Then we call that current siting. And that works out to about 1.1 million acres would be appropriate for solar if we didn't care about any of the natural resource values. And then I'll point your attention to this middle scenario that we created. That'll be featured in our results here. And we call this our protecting nature scenario, because we started with that 1.1 million, and then we kind of funneled down using a couple of different screens, which included, let's take out all the prime farmland because we need that for food productivity. Let's take out our best biodiversity and wildlife habitat that the state has mapped. Let's take out the top 75% of the sites that have the highest forest carbon content. And then some lands that we know are really important for reducing flooding impacts and so forth. And so that 1.1 million shrank a lot. It went down to 94,000 acres. And so that's the sort of set that we're working with of sites that could support solar, but also be protective of nature and natural resource values. So those are our two scenarios. And this is that first scenario, that current siting trend. Everything you see there in the teal is a place that could support solar based on slope and other things like that. So that's the 1.1 million acres. And then we said, okay, well, of that, what does the energy model tell us would be the lowest cost places to do those projects? And what would that configuration look like? So everything you see there in the orange is sort of the best and the least cost options. And you see they're pretty big places. We did a zoom out of sort of Franklin and Hampton counties there, and you can see some pretty large parcels, because generally as a developer, you want to do as big a project as possible. That's how you get your economies of scale. So even if you get like 3 landowners together and do one project across 3 different landowners, you're going to try to do as big as you can. So that's kind of like, if we just keep doing what we're doing, that's the kind of footprint that we'll see. Versus the next one is our kind of protecting nature scenario. And here we have, you can see much less of the state covered. So these are areas that are appropriate for solar, but also meet those criteria: no farmland, very low forest carbon, and so forth. So you see much smaller number of total acres, going from the 94,000 to about the lowest cost ones are going to be in the sort of 40 to 80,000 of those acres are places where it's most cost effective. And you see they're smaller projects. They're going to be, our distribution that we saw was, up to 20 acres mostly. So some of those other projects that you saw on the previous slide are going to be 100, 200, 800. The biggest projects we've been doing here have been in the 1,300. I've been talking to colleagues in Virginia. I don't know if you guys have been following the data centers that are being built to support AI. Northern Virginia is the global hotspot for these data centers, and they are looking for power to power these, and they're looking to do 7, 8, 9,000 acre solar projects in Virginia to support some of that power demand. So these are, in the global scale, relatively small, but for Massachusetts, pretty impactful. So these are graphs of the actual solar capacity, and that's the number we care about because we know that's how much energy we need by the state's estimates to decarbonize our power. So the bottom line here is, if you compare our current siting where we get to 25 gigawatts by 2050, and the breakout there is about 9 of that is rooftop, the other 16 is that ground mount that you see. And then when we move over and we shrink the number of sites for ground mount, we do drop down from 25 to 21 gigawatts. We still have the same amount of rooftop, but we have less ground mount solar in the aggregate. And what's really interesting in the United States, all the rooftop solar we've been doing, and it's been great. If you have it and you get to net meter it, it's pretty fantastic. But on average, we're actually spending a bit more than globally. Australia is kind of the winner here. They're installing rooftop solar in Australia for $1 per watt as of 2022. I had to say, from everything I've read, the Australians have made it almost too easy because some of the projects are not the highest quality. But, in Australia, you sit down on your laptop, you can get a permit for your solar in 20 minutes. Whereas here, we've got 351 towns permitting rooftop solar individually, which doesn't make a ton of sense. So there's a lot of costs in terms of the rooftop systems in particular that they're what we call soft costs. So it's like the permitting, the market, the guys who are coming to your door. And if you look at, what the true cost of the system itself between the panels, and the balance of system costs and the inverter, they are actually less than half of the total cost. So part of it is we need to figure out how to drop those soft costs down. And if we can, we did a run with a lower rooftop cost, assuming we can kind of figure out how to reduce some of these components of that cost. And what we found was, with a lower rooftop cost, by 2050, our rooftop can go up to 15 from 9 gigawatts. And then we get the 10 gigawatts of ground mount, and we're actually at the same amount of solar as the current siting scenario. So what does this look like on the landscape? So what we did is we've got 3 metrics here. We have total forest carbon emissions across these 2 scenarios. We have losses of some of that best habitat for wildlife, and we have losses of prime farmland. And so that current siting status quo trend, we have almost 6 million metric tons of CO2 released from clearing of forests and also impacting other forms of terrestrial carbon versus 1.1 million. So that difference is almost 5 million metric tons over that time frame from now up to 2050. And then, of course, we would lose, almost 21,000 acres of that best high biodiversity land, and a little over 8,000 of the prime farmland. And you look at those numbers and you're like, that's pretty tiny footprint if you think about a state with 5 million acres, but it's really about the quality of that habitat. It's some of our best habitat. So, our scenario is designed to kind of move the solar away from some of the best habitat, some of the most forest carbon rich places. And when we do that, even we haven't assumed that no forests are used for these, but we're steering away from some of our kind of top most carbon rich forests. So kind of keep those numbers in mind, because what we'll see is in terms of the cost, I mentioned earlier, if you're a solar developer, you're going to try to build the biggest project you can because you get more economies of scale. All the sort of fixed costs that you have to do, they get spread out over more units of capacity, and you generate more power. So when we go from those bigger projects, the cost of the bigger projects, the current siting is the blue, and then that increment of the yellow on top is kind of the additional cost of if we start doing smaller projects and do more rooftop projects. And over this time frame over here on the left-hand side, if you add up that incremental cost in the yellow, it works out to just under $1 billion out to 2050. $1 billion is a lot, right? But if you talk about, our power system, this is tens of billions of dollars we spend every year on electric power and on the distribution and the transmission. So in the grand scheme of our total power system, that's not enormous. And I don't in any way want to diminish any additional costs, because there are ratepayers that pay that, right? You and me, but also folks who struggle with the amount of energy costs we have here in the state. But, it's just under $1 billion to kind of move to a more distributed, smaller project kind of footprint. So the thing is, with carbon and with nature, we don't trade it in markets, right? Generally, we don't put a dollar value on it, even though we value it, and it's very important. And, as economists, we have started to actually try to figure out what is a value of a ton of carbon emissions that doesn't get emitted? Like, how much less global warming will we have if we can reduce carbon by certain amounts, right? So we've started to really put some numbers to this. And what we've figured out is if we need more carbon removal in here, especially in the sort of 2040 to 2050 period, and we've got to create like direct air capture machines. Remember that $150 a ton, $200 a ton I referenced earlier? If we think about that difference in carbon between the two scenarios, which worked out to be about, I think it was 5 million tons, it was like 4.7. And we multiply that times $200 per ton, we wind up, and I swear I didn't like make this up, we work out to almost $900 million, which was the number you saw earlier in terms of the cost difference of the solar, doing the smaller footprint solar. So that's all to say that when folks say it's cheaper to do these big solar projects, it's like, well, only if you don't count biodiversity or carbon as having any value. When you actually put value on that carbon, on that biodiversity, everything changes as far as the economics of the system. The solar industry is not that happy with this calculation. The other thing that's really important for where this solar winds up is, are there places in terms of the electric grid for them to connect in? Once they build the project, they've got to plug it into this system of wires and transmission and distribution all over the state. And that cost can be really high. The further you away from the spot where you connect in, it's more expensive. So the green areas here are where the nodes are. It might be a substation, might be a transmission line. And then the further you go away from those green nodes, the more the cost is to connect in. So it's about $1 million a mile. So you want to be if you're a project developer, you want to be as close to one of those and it has to have space for you to plug in. And part of what is so different about the grid now that we're using all these small renewables all over the place instead of these big central power plants is that there's a lot more demand for these interconnection sites. So we're having to build a lot more of them. And that is going to really shape how the footprint of solar and other things in the future looks. So one of the things we have our eye on is let's make sure we choose the sites for those spots for it to plug in. Like think about a giant connector for, for our power laptops, but think about that for the projects that get developed. So that's a really important part. A lot of parts of the country, there's a long queue, a really long list of projects that are waiting for approval to get connected by the utilities. In the power grid to the south of us, where Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland are, they have like tens of thousands of solar projects that people want to develop, but they need to be able to connect in. So this is just an example of where one of the utilities, this is National Grid, has estimated where some of these new sites will go. So you can see, like that green dot, which looks like I think it's in Franklin County there in the middle. That's a super forested part of the state. If that gets built, then there's going to be a lot of projects get proposed to be close to that. So that's something we have to keep in mind when we pick those sites. So just to sort of sum up what we kind of walked away from this analysis, and to be totally honest, we didn't know what the analysis would show when we started it. And I have my own skepticism about, like, even if we need 100,000 acres or 200,000 acres for these projects, that to me isn't, from a conservation perspective, isn't an enormous number, but it's like which acres really, really matters, right? So really, we want to shift the solar to the maximum extent feasible from those best sites, some of which we've seen converted in the last decade, to the sites that are lower impact for carbon, for biodiversity. And I was just on a call on Monday where I heard a solar developer make the same argument that I've heard repeatedly, which is very frustrating to me, which is that if we cut down a forest and put solar there, the benefit in terms of climate and emissions reductions from the solar is better than the emission reductions from the forest, which is basically another way of saying is nature is worth more dead than alive as far as, and my point is, like, can we have both, right? That's our kind of viewpoint. Like, let's figure out how we can hold on to that forest, especially the best ones, right? To the extent we can. We're not unrealistic. We're not in a position of saying we've cut trees on our own property to do solar. We've got 10 installations around the state, but that's an argument that we feel like is a false choice. If you do this mapping and you're really intentional about it, you can actually find ways to not have that dichotomy. And then again, when we put a number and put a value on that carbon, the project economics change significantly. As far as what's really our cheapest way of meeting our carbon goals and climate goals. And we really need to be thinking about where we put the new connection sites as we build out the grid over the next 20 years. So we were like, okay, well, we've got all the answers. Now what? I've been doing this kind of work for a long time. We do all these great reports and analyses, and so many of them sit on the shelf and never impact policy in any way. And this was a true exception to that this year. I think we kind of caught this at the right moment. It's been a growing concern across the state. There have been a lot of communities that are frustrated by their inability to have any say in where the development of solar happens. Interestingly, the part of the zoning law, which in the Commonwealth, as you all know, towns have a lot of say over land use change, generally speaking. But there is a part of the zoning law, 40A Section 3, that really got put there in the 80s for solar thermal that said no municipality shall unreasonably regulate solar. And so communities that have tried to either say no to a ground mount project or to reshape them, those have been rejected by the Attorney General as violations of the zoning law in general. So that's been a point of frustration, political problems, and yet the administration really wants to do solar and meet our climate goals. And so the governor put into effect a commission on energy siting and permitting last year. And I sat on that commission. The charge of that commission was to make recommendations to the legislature on how to address some of these siting and permitting challenges. The other thing that is also happening is the state is changing how this solar incentive program runs that helps support some of those landfill projects, the brownfield projects, the solar canopies. And that's happening at the same time. And that bill that I mentioned also happened this summer and fall. So it all sort of happened, in the last 9 months, which honestly, that never happens. And things don't move that smoothly. So our big recommendations on the solar incentive program were like, look, we've got to better align some of the incentives to avoid conversion of those lands, because the state has a whole bunch of plans that require protecting 30% of the state by the year 2030, holding on to that carbon so we can meet our solar goals, biodiversity goals that are being set. And, in terms of events like this, where we talk to the public and hear from folks at our sanctuaries, we're hearing very loud and clear that folks do not want state ratepayer dollars to help subsidize projects that go into our best natural areas. So, we provided that input, and, incredibly, we're really excited by what we just heard just a few days ago. I sat in a meeting, the state came out with this proposal for the next version of this program. And right up front, their objectives are, to protect our higher value forests, contributing to these emission reductions, balancing development within the built environment with some of the most cost-effective, smaller ground mount projects. And then for the projects that do get built, where there are some trees that are lost or biodiversity or habitat that is impacted, there need to be mitigation payments to the state, so the state can then go out and protect additional land. So we're extremely happy about the sort of goals and objectives here. And the way that they're trying to do this is, this is a somewhat elaborate scoring system that takes into account carbon storage, ecological integrity of land, agriculture, some of our best soils in terms of agricultural potential, really looking at which communities already have a lot of the solar. And so, to be fair in terms of the equity of where you put more solar, do you really want to put it in a place that already has a lot, is part of what we've been hearing too, particularly from some of those communities you saw on that first map. So we're pretty excited about this. We think there's some work to be done on the details, but, in terms of the framework and what it's trying to do, it's doing exactly what we were talking about earlier, which is really starting to put a value onto the carbon, onto the biodiversity and the nature. And then just last week as well, the governor signed a climate bill that embedded a lot of the recommendations that will apply to bigger projects. And that includes the state will need to create new criteria to define the sites to preferentially put some of the solar and the other energy infrastructure. There will need to be mitigation of any impacts to nature. You'll have to look at communities, to see what the cumulative impact of doing another project would be, especially for environmental justice communities that have had a lot of infrastructure built and exposure to fossil fuels. It will make these projects go faster to permitting, because it's sort of streamlining a lot of the extra steps in there that are happening now. And the state, importantly for you as a town, has committed to providing support to towns on guidance on how you all need to interpret this, because the towns will be the ones in charge of permitting most of the solar projects. For very, very big projects, they'll go to the Energy Facilities Siting Board, but generally that will not be most solar projects. That'll only be over 25 megawatts, which I don't see that happening in Carlisle, but it could happen in some places. But So again, this is something we've been in support of, and there's a lot of work to do. There will be a whole rulemaking where we have to establish what those criteria are. But directionally, this is the right way to go for our forests and our natural marking lands. This is just something that I wanted to flag for folks that we've been working on. We have set up what we call our Catalyst Fund, which is $75 million fund for protecting nature and biodiversity and carbon. And the goal is we've raised some of this money already, and it's meant to really match with federal dollars, with state dollars, to start to really catalyze the protection of some of those areas. So we can meet that 30 by 30 goal and keep that carbon removal and that biodiversity function of these lands. So the areas in red and the orange are, those are our top priorities for protection across the state. So, we're optimistic that, this system, if we can get it working right, that we have a chance to protect these lands and meet our solar goals that are going to be so important to decarbonizing the power sector. So that was a lot, I know. Thanks for bearing with, but if you wanted to read the full report, that's on our webpage under the growing solar, and it's got all of our assumptions and a lot of the detail on the analytics. So I'm going to stop there and take questions.
Very informative, thank you. So any questions from the audience? And we'll see what comes through from the.
Sarah, are you able to read from the chat?
I will, as soon as they come back. Everybody's.
Are there any ground mount projects in Carlisle that folks know of?
Oh, ground mount?
Yeah.
There's canopy, but there is some ground mount, but like on residential property, right?
It's nothing big.
Mm-hmm.
There was an attempt to have a solar overlay a while back. But that didn't go through. We have one question. Is it possible to install solar fields above roads?
Well, in terms of the legal basis, I don't know the answer to that part of it. I know this is happening in other parts of the world. And in places like Arizona, they're purposely putting solar above reservoirs and other water sources to reduce the evaporation. And so people are getting very creative with, and I saw somewhere somebody put it over, somewhere in Europe, they put it over bike lanes. And, I think there are probably some legal considerations about roads, but I mean, technically, there's no reason that you couldn't do that. Just like you could put it over a parking lot or any kind of tarmac. The issue with the parking lot systems, and people love them once they're up, especially in this part of the world, because it helps with the sun and the rain and the snow. They're roughly twice the cost of a medium-sized commercial solar rooftop project because of the steel, right? So that's your main cost component to doing more canopy solar. So I saw a system up in northern New Hampshire that was actually, instead of steel, using cross-laminated timber. I don't know if folks are familiar with that construction material, but it's sort of compressed wood that is a pretty novel solution for a place that has a pretty good source of wood.
So just for your information, we do have a canopy mounted system that's quite large in the school parking lot. And that was actually what I would call a merchant installation.
Yeah.
Resco found it sufficiently profitable to do that.
Yeah, and Resco's done a lot of the parking lot canopy systems for the state, the community colleges. And the analysis that we did found that a lot of that land you saw under the protecting nature scenario, there's a lot of it is owned by municipalities. And we're sharing that data with the state because we're really hoping that the towns and towns are already leading on this. I mean, Newton has done a lot of canopy solar. And that the state can really plus up some of those incentives so that towns can do more. Is the goal.
Is there a reason to not consider the down the middle strip of a highway type of solar that I've seen pictures of now and again?
There's quite a bit here that we've used highway strips. I think more on the exterior if you're out on the Mass Pike. But there have been quite a few spots and which is interesting. We've talked to some of the solar developers who have tried to do more of those by roadsides. And often there's opposition locally and based on the aesthetics. And they've said to us, and we agree, like, we would prefer to have them on the roadside than up in the forest, right? And so that's something to take into consideration as the state comes out with its guidelines and hopefully provides towns with a kind of a model bylaw, is to really start thinking about, would you prefer to have it by the roadside or clearing forest, or, you know, impacting something maybe more hidden, but more valuable from a natural resource perspective.
There was another question. Remotely, has the state considered funding municipalities to install solar municipal structures on municipal structures?
So there's a couple different ways. I mean, I think for a school that would come through the school construction fund that the state, you know, provides a part of that funding. That would be a different part of the budget, but the Green Communities program would be another place where there would be support for municipal solar, whether it's, you know, on the ground on a low impact site or rooftop system. And then the SMART program really applies to projects under 5 megawatts in size. And so that's another place. And I'm not entirely sure how that, you know, can you stack some of those resources? And then of course the IRA funding too is, I hope will stay around.
The municipal, but there's so many still like strip malls and huge roof surfaces.
Yeah.
Are there any incentives to sort of tap those large scale commercial?
Yeah.
roofs?
The challenge, the commercial sector is pretty challenging. And we've talked to a lot of folks about this and kind of hear different things, but there's a couple things working against the commercial sector. I mean, a lot of those big stores, and I know that, you know, Walmart and a few others have really deployed quite a bit, Home Depot. But they build those buildings as inexpensively as possible, sort of right up to code, right? And in New England, you know, part of that is you've got to build for snow load. And basically to have snow load and solar and that weight, like most buildings actually are not built to that standard. So that's something that, and then, you know, for a lot of building owners, especially folks that own parking lots, from their vantage point, it's like, look, I might want to use this for something else in 10 years. I'm not going to lease, you know, go into a 20-year lease on this parking lot because I want to have the optionality to sell the whole property in 10 years to put my kids through college or whatever. So there's a lot of kind of like non-market barriers to the solar sector or the commercial sector. But there's a lot there. And so like, how can we start to think about how to bring some of those folks into the market? I mean, there definitely are some for sure. But some of those, you know, it looks like an obvious place to do it. And in some ways it could be, but there may be a building issue. There may be something else going on there.
There's been a big increase in efficiency of solar over the last 20 years.
Yes.
Do your projections take into account any additional increases in efficiency?
It's a great question, and I'll even broaden it to I mean, I think one of the things that's so interesting, and I don't think I have it in this deck, but you know, all the estimates that the state, not just our state, but other states and folks have done running these energy models to say, well, here's how much solar costs now. So if we want to do this much, this is how much it costs and so forth. And that stuff is constantly changing. So the thing that is especially promising, there probably can be some additional reductions in the efficiency, which changes the capacity factors for solar in a positive direction. But I think the thing with the biggest potential to change how much solar and wind we need is energy storage. And there's a lot of new battery technologies under development now, including by a really cool company called Form Energy that spun off of MIT. And I don't know if anyone has done solar and has done like a Tesla Powerwall, you know, with the residential battery. It's great if your power goes out on a dark and stormy night like tonight, right? Because you've got that backup power. But the thing is, with those lithium batteries, they only hold on to the power, you know, you might get it from one day to the next. But what really is important with these intermittent sources of power, like solar and wind, is how great if we could store that power to use it on that super hot day in the middle of summer when everybody's running their AC, right? That's when we really hit our peak. And so that's called medium duration or long duration storage, to be able to stretch it out, save it, you know, 5 weeks before you want to use it. And that's the battery technology that's being developed now. And Form Energy is going to be deploying one of these up in Maine. And once we have that, that technology will really reduce the amount of generation that we need to build, because we can store some of it. So that's what hasn't been built into a lot of the state's projections. And that's the promising thing with like technology change. We're going to see some changes in what we need over the next 30 years.
Is that the iron air battery?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Pretty cool stuff.
This is maybe a silly question. Is there any way to like move solar around so that, I mean, if somebody doesn't want it in their parking lot, like you could move around places like where it's captured? I don't know.
The parking lots, I mean, again, like I'm wondering where's the innovation here? Like, is there something where something more temporary could be constructed, right?
Yeah.
Maybe with cross-laminated timber instead of steel. I don't know about the engineering of that, but in Europe, they're actually allowing people in Europe, you can buy a panel, just a couple of panels at Home Depot, and kind of hang them on your balcony in your apartment building and plug them right into your system. So there's a lot of innovation that's happening in other parts of the world that we probably need to figure out how to bring back. And the utilities are a big part of this system, so they have a lot of the rules about, you know, how much behind the meter solar can be done. We have a lot of work to do on the grid and just even the transformers in the neighborhoods to be able to handle enough solar. But I expect that over the next 10 years that some of those things will start to change.
It has nothing to do with siting, well, it might be it does. But I understand that with a lot of the large installations, birds are actually affected, thinking that it's bodies of water. They crash into them and kind of break their legs and stuff. Do you know of any like innovation or anything that's maybe being developed to help prevent that?
I feel like I should have a better answer to this than I have working for the Audubon Society. I don't know. I mean, I you know, one of the things that is also on the plus side is folks are working on pollinator habitat or in and around solar sites. But as far as the bird strikes, I'm not sure. I mean, I imagine some of the same things that with buildings might be helpful as far as, you know, putting stickers and things that, but I don't know the answer to that. Anything else online?
Nothing in line right now.
Okay, well, thanks again for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And you have it online now, so if other questions come in, we're happy to field them.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll be sending you a video.
Great, fantastic. Well, thanks for coming out on a dark and stormy night.
Thank you.
Everything else about the same.